Good morning, Doctor, and thanks for your time this morning. So let's start with the positive news. Let's talk about what South Africa is doing right in terms of the advances that this report actually refers to.
I think the report clearly shows that there's steady progress in South Africa, particularly with respect to the 1990 strategy. In other words, that 90% of people who are infected get tested, and that those that are tested, 90% of them gets onto treatment, and 90% of those on treatment have their viral load suppressed. What we are seeing in some communities in South Africa is that that other communities have actually moved ahead and in fact have even surpassed the targets that were set for 2020. In Ishewe in particular, they have actually met their targets. They are at 90, 95, 94. So that's great progress. Mm-hmm. But at the center of this is what communities have been able to do. It clearly shows from the work in Ishewe that if you empower communities, you are able to get the results you want to get.
I mean, but not too long ago, we were very concerned. There was a bit of panic about ARV shortages and access and clinics not having enough and having to borrow from one another. Has that not impacted what research was done here? Or despite all of that, we are still seeing these advances?
I think there clearly is unevenness in terms of the advances that we are making. The advances are not equal, but community after community effort is really being made. We know that there are still major challenges around keeping people who have tested positive on treatment, and people who are on treatment are also dropping out of treatment. That's part of the challenge that we continue to face. But overall, I think it's very clear that communities like we have seen in KZN, once they are properly mobilized and once there's sufficient investment in those communities, we're able to get the results that we want to get. But I think the challenge going forward is how can we sustain this good results that we are seeing community after community? Are we going to be able to maintain the same level of intensity? Because let's face it, AIDS is far, far, far from over, and we really need to get communities to not to take the foot off the pedal, but to continue to make sure that people have access to life-saving treatment and we prevent preventable deaths.
Okay, so the report also showing that key populations and their sexual partners now account for more than half. That's about 54% of the new HIV infections globally. Tell us more about that and what they found and where we're seeing this.
I think for the first time we have seen that, in fact, overall, half of the global new infections are coming from key populations. That's a staggering, figure, and the majority of this are obviously coming from different key population: men having sex with men, transgender communities, people who inject drugs, sex workers. And so on, and so prisoners, and so on and so forth. But the majority of some of these infections are really coming from regions like Central Asia, the Middle East, and also parts of Latin America. And that is not to say that in our region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we are not seeing those major upsurge of infections in key populations. Key populations remain populations that are at the margins that we need to make additional effort to make sure that we can deal with this epidemic.
What is the report saying about children when it comes to the impact of HIV/AIDS, Doctor, and women and young girls as well?
With respect to children, the report is very clear that, in fact, globally and collectively we are failing children. We had set several targets for children for 2018. We had wanted to ensure that by 2018 we had put 1.6 million children on treatment. We have missed that target. We had set ourselves a target of ensuring that we get at least less than 40,000 new infections among children. Again, we have missed that target. So we really need to invest in children. Because they're actually falling through the treatment cascade. I think that's a very important piece of work that remains to be done. But with respect to adolescent girls and young women, they continue to bear the brunt of the epidemic, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. In South Africa alone, we know that this age group, particularly adolescent girls and young women, 15 to 24, we have about 200 new infections per day in South Africa alone. So again, if we're going to bend the curve and get ahead of this epidemic, we really need to invest in young people and making sure that actually we can actually bring this epidemic under control.
Thanks very much for that. That's Dr. Mbulawa Mugabe. He's the UNAIDS Country Director for South Africa. That's all we have time for to reflect on this report, just telling us there's some good news for South Africa. We seem to be making some strides in the battle against HIV/AIDS.